the organizing team, for Dana especially for putting in all this work, but also Brenda, Di and Robert and Patrick for bringing us out here. It's always a thrill for me in Toronto. I wish I could come more often. And it's been just a thrill meeting with students and working with my fellow panelists. And thank you all for coming out on a Friday afternoon. I'm so impressed. Today, instead of giving a more formal paper, because I've been in a very reflective mode lately, and I'll explain why in a minute, I thought what I'll do is just to give you some of my thoughts and also feelings around the few topics that I'm signposting here that have been kind of on my mind, been haunting me a little bit, so I thought I'd share them. The reason I've been so reflective is because I had a big birthday just a couple of months ago. Turning 50 is kind of shocking, and I was kind of deluding myself. I thought living on queer time means you never grow old, and it's in fact not true. And the other thing that led me to kind of getting reflective has to do with Di and Robert and JP Katongo recently co-edited a special issue on Asia Queer Canadian in Topia that's coming right out, and they were very kind and asked me to contribute a short essay. And they said, you can get as personal as you want. And I ended up writing quite an intimate piece, which led me to realize that looking back in a kind of decade and a half doing queer scholarship has been so impacted by myself living a queer life in blacking out. It's been really impacted by my experience living a queer life in a city like Vancouver. And
just touch the screen.
Okay. Wow. Hang on, sorry, let me get back to my face. And so writing that piece really made me want to reflect on the connection between living queer lives in queer communities and doing queer scholarship. And the other thing that kind of shocked me into reflective mode was I looked at the table of content of the journal issue and realized there were all these really exciting and very young scholars who were in the journal, and I really see the kind of generational shift happening. But luckily for me, I wasn't the only Ulster in the issue, and you could tell the great Richard Thong was above me. And Richard, being the true artist, unlike me moping about losing queer time, Richard made a film about that kind of generational feeling. Richard's film, remarkable film Reorientations. I think a lot of you have seen it, yes? Oh, if you haven't, you should. It's really a Toronto film. But what Richard did was that 30 years ago, he made this iconic film Orientation, which was, for a lot of us, for queer Asians, it's the first video we see representing us in North America on video. But after 30 years have passed, Richard did this project of asking some of the subjects he filmed in Orientation to look at how they talked and how they lived and how they were represented. So this amazing still was actually of someone watching how they were filmed 30 years ago. But Richard was like adamantly non-nostalgic, so he also interviewed a new generation of queer activists. I see at least one of them in the audience, and maybe there are a few more. And to kind of ponder and reflect on what had shifted, how the conversations had changed. And he looked at things like, there have been demographic shift in a city like Toronto where, went from being a majority white city to being really a majority people of color space. He talked about the rapid shift in activist vocabulary, and also the kind of really passage from organizing community around identity to different kinds of organizing. Now in Vancouver, we brought Richard and his film back to our city after it premiered at the Queer Film Festival. And we also organized kind of an intergenerational dialogue around the film. And after that, we invited Richard, Fanua, Antwi, Christine Kim, and myself. We kind of wrote a reflection piece on the whole experience. And in Richard's section, he ended in this way. He talked about how 30 years ago, queer Asian organizing was really about community building with a very explicit goals. But when he made Reorientations, the film kind of ended on what Judy Han has been saying, well, maybe the identitarian project is no longer sufficient. And Judy Han said there has to be more. But she left it open what that more is. And Richard himself, in this reflection piece, also wants to end with this speculation, but not wanting to kind of really shut down what possibilities are. It's just this sense, this lingering feeling that there has to be more. And so in that spirit, I've been, in being in this mode, I've been trying to look for what is that more? What are this kind of what Richard called the other ways of doing things? And of course, I live in three spaces mostly, right? In the classroom, teaching students. I do scholarship, so I would look for that within scholarship, what my colleagues are doing. And finally, because I lived a queer life in the community, I also want to see what's going on in the community, especially what young activists are doing. And so I just want to share with you what I've observed in these three spaces. What have been some possibilities of other ways of doing things? So in the classroom, I have to teach a graduate seminar on queer trans studies to MA and PhD students. They would come to my class after they've done their feminist theory, their feminist methodology, right? I'm supposed to equip them with queer and trans knowledge. So usually what I do, I would squeeze all the canonical queer theory within the first 3 weeks, let's say. They learn all that stuff, and then I thought, I've exposed them to all the really great contemporary work that's happening from Queer Diaspora, all the queer work out of Latin America, out of Africa, and because of my own connection to Queer Asia, I had them read a lot of work coming out of Asia, queer ecology, queer indigeneity, all of that work. And usually we had a really, really great conversation around all the topics. But what I learned was that by the end of the semester, when they do their final project, and they do everything from, I had a paper on tentacle porn in anime. And I had a paper, the same class, I had a paper on, the Rainbow Refugee Project, right? But what I found, it doesn't matter whether they are doing, tentacle porn or Rainbow Refugee, they go back to the old theoretical framework. When they set up the theoretical framework, they cite, the Holy Trinity, they cite Foucault, Cedric, Butler, right? Even though we only spend 3 weeks on that, we spend the rest of the time on all of these other works. And so it was curious to me, and I wanted to ask them why. And they said, because that's theory. All the other stuff you have me read, they're about the Philippines, or they're about this local case that's not theoretical. And so in that sense, I really realized when I'm teaching a grad class, I really need to do extra work if I want them to theorize differently, to not theorize from the so-called canon. We did a game once where we do the post-colonial move of provincializing Western theory, and we try to play with titles like, maybe it really should be Gender Trouble in New York, or it should be the history of sexuality in Western Europe. And when we do that in that way, you realize in some way what they count as theory is in fact no more universal than what they see as provincial or local. And then we try to kind of do how you can theorize, let's say from Robert's work on the Philippines. Can you use that work to theorize about some other context? And it's interesting because I think even 10 years ago I was trying to do this project. There was an special issue of Inter-Asia Cultural Studies where we call local queer theory. But I realize now, 10 years later, that we made a mistake. We should not have framed it around local theory because that still got ghettoized. That is seen as theorizing from Taiwan, well, that's just local to Taiwan. So now I want to think not of local queer theory, but of theorizing trans-locally. And so what does that mean? And it was a really interesting talking to grad students about it. Because what they're often afraid of is, well, I don't know anything about Philippines, and I'm doing a project on queer Syrian refugees in Vancouver. How could I, what connection can I make between the two? And so even sometimes don't even like the word transnational, even that's kind of what thematic, because I think transnational still keep the kind of crossing over as between nations. So students think of transnational work as, well, between queer American work or, queer Chinese work, but it really shouldn't be like that, right? It's really the transing, the crossing over should be about how one local context from the ground may impact the way you look at another local context. So even yesterday when we did the experimental classroom, we were looking at a very local case of Vancouver, and students in the classroom were trying to, in some way, theorize from that experience to think how they apply to Toronto. And for me, that's already a kind of trans-local case. And obviously, then you can do it in much kind of broader context, in that, for instance, Audrey Yu writes very eloquently about Singapore. She calls it a disjunctive queer modernity, which is when you can, contrast between a very repressive legal regime that still criminalizes homosexuality on the one hand, and then a very vibrant queer life on the other, where queer subjects just negotiate in many different ways with the government. And then I had students who saw, oh my God, yeah, I work in the Saudi Arabian context or in the Iranian context where they see something similar. And then I encourage them, yeah, use the Singapore case to theorize your Syrian or your Iranian case, right? And for me, then that is doing theory translocally. Now, I didn't invent that. In fact, I think I learned the practice of that through my experience with a particular intellectual movement in Inter-Asia Cultural Studies. Now, my connection with Inter-Asia Cultural Studies also had something to do with my own location. I did my PhD in the US, but then I found myself settling in Vancouver in Canada. And I kind of gradually, in some way, didn't go to the kind of US network anymore. I found myself not doing so many conferences in North America. And then I find myself being drawn to, because it's so easy to cross the Pacific. I was going more to conferences in Asia, in Australia. And then I began to kind of have a slightly different network. And the Inter-Asia Cultural Studies, if you don't know about it already, is an intellectual movement and a project that kind of started in the late 90s. And what it really wants is kind of politics, is to think about how you can build an intellectual movement based in Asia. And there's a kind of ambition or aspiration to, if not bypass the West, to provide an alternative intellectual framework than the canonical Western theory that we know. And very impressively, they've gone from, just a bunch of intellectuals having drinks in different cities to being able to have an actual intellectual network where they have biannual conferences always in Asian cities, and that's actually quite highly cited journal that they were able to put together. But it started off being intellectuals dissatisfied with their institutional location and wanting to build something themselves, right? So I've been going to Inter-Asia for a long time, and what I realized is queer work was really welcome. And there were, generations of young queer studies scholars, particularly those based in Asia, whose work maybe, my students wouldn't have read, but that they were publishing in a lot of more Asia-based circuit, and they knew each other's work. And what was really amazing about my Inter-Asia experience is that what Inter-Asia is really about. Chen Guanxing wrote the book, it's from Duke University, so University Press, you might know it, called Asia's Method. And what Chen did in that book was he very deliberately, he only cited thinkers from South Asia and East Asia, right? He talked about decolonization, and he deliberately did not cite any European thinkers. And he talked about it, he theorized it. And it's not about essentializing the Asian thinkers, it's simply about, let's try to have a different referential network, framework. Let's see what we can do if we only cite Asian thinkers. And the other thing that Chen did is also talking about this translocal theorizing. He talked about how walking in Seoul helps him really understand Taiwan, right? And it's exactly that sense of, you don't have to see the study of Seoul as having nothing to do with your study of Taiwan. That in fact, putting what you learn from one local context to the other it can make for like a really interesting intellectual engagement. Now the danger of Inter-Asia is a lot of people tend to approach it as in the area studies lens. Oh, it's still about Asia. But in fact, if you notice, it's inter-Asia, not intra-Asia. And the point is that Asia becomes simply an imaginary. And Chao Ban-Kwa has written about it as the improbable coexistence of multiple Asias. You can only be inter if there's more than one Asia, right? So all the queer work that came out of the inter-Asia context really, looked a lot at, for instance, the flows and influences within the region. There are like great studies of queer boy band, Thai boy band that are really a kind of queer fandom of K-pop singers, for instance. Or you look at work, the disjunctive modernity of Singapore, for instance, can probably be applied to a lot of other East Asian society. So this kind of work, I think, also can be taken outside of Asia. And in fact, I think the mistake of Inter-Asia is to name it Inter-Asia, because its ethics and its intellectual project of interreferencing, of translocal theorizing, is something that is not restricted to Asia, and that Asia really should be seen as method only, right? And so one of the project I'm collaborating with a few other colleagues is to look at Inter-Asia outside of Asia. How can that politics and that ethics that interreferential framework and that translocal theorizing can be applied for other kind of configurations and alliances. And I think yesterday Gayatri already referred a little bit to the self-self theorizing. And you can kind of think about building networks that really do bypass the West, and you look at kind of other realignments, right? So I think for queer theory, that is especially important for queer studies, so that not everything has to be routed through the global queer. Not everything has to just be compared to kind of North American queerness. And so recently, and I'm very gratified in that I think that it's already beginning to happen in queer trans studies. So the project that is coming out, I'll give it a little plug. This issue is going to come out in August. I co-edited an issue in Transgender Studies Quarterly on trans in Asia, Asian trans. And we really did not want the issue to be about Asia. We really want Asia, the studying transness in Asia to contribute to trans studies in general. And I realized a lot of the contributors, they're already doing that they take that one more step. They ground their research on very local context. You got like great ethnography of beauty pageants in the Philippines. You have like really great grounded study about, for instance, a history of Indonesian trans organizing, right? And yet they take the extra step to theorize from that local context. There's one author, Emmanuel David, who uses the great term, the archipelago imaginary, right? To talk about how the non-continental character of Philippines offer a different way of viewing queerness and looking at kind of trans relationality. And I think then that critique of the continental thinking is something that all of us can learn about, right? What does it mean when you look from islands perspective? And as I think it's really important for queer and trans scholars who are working outside of the West to really be more ambitious, and when we're looking at local case, to take that step and really theorize it. There's a lot of attention to flows and mutual influences within a region or across regions. So like I said, instead of always, if you study transness in Asia, you realize it's a historically very rich genealogy of gender categories that don't fit into either trans or queer. And instead of always saying, well, is Bakla related to queer, is warrior, trans, what is the relation between those two? Warrior in Indonesia or Bakla in Philippines, right? Or many of those kind of slang terms that queer and trans communities use in Asian society, that you don't always have to see how they relate to LGBTQ. You, in fact, have to see how they relate to each other and how they influence each other. And so that's another really kind of important thing that I find that has come out of this issue. And finally, we can always, I think it's a politics to do a kind of minor trans work. And I think Gayatri called it self-self connection. And Xu Meishi has talked about minor transnationalism in her work, and I really am quite inspired by that formulation. And in some way a little bit different from self-self, the minor can incorporate minor in a way that is both resistant and complicit with the major. So a place like Canada, we're a minor power and a minor empire that has be partly complicit with colonial history, but at the same time we're also minor to the major empires of, say, US or China currently. So that minor, that valence of the minor, I think is really important. And then to look at how different minor empires, minor powers deal with power is a really interesting project. And I see that also emerging in a lot of queer trans studies in that way. So, finally, I will maybe close with my inspiration from the ground. So, we teach and we do scholarship, but I also live, right? I like going to film screenings. I like having venues to flirt with people. I like knowing I can retire in a queer-friendly space, right? So all of those things are really, in Vancouver, you depend a lot on the queer communities. Now, what I find I think it really struck me of the very character of living in Vancouver was one year I was having dim sum with two very different and also, famous queer studies people. We were in Vancouver for a conference, and David Ng, a lot of you know his work, and Audrey Yu, we're three of us were having dim sum. And what was interesting, David is based in Philadelphia and often goes to New York, very East Coast now, right? So David's like saying, God, it's so like so hard to travel to Vancouver. It's so far away, I have to go through custom, really can't hold a conference here anymore. Audrey Yu at that time was working in Melbourne and transiting through Singapore. Audrey looks at David and said, "You're mad, this is like so close, this is so easy for me to get to. Do you know what I have to do to get to New York or the East Coast," right? And so I really realized, being the Vancouver person in that conversation, that it really depends on where you are. Vancouver is very far and very minor and very marginal to probably Toronto and New York people, right? But Vancouver, for the Asia Pacific region, we're almost part of it. And so for Asian, Australian, New Zealander, coming to Vancouver is not a hardship. The way maybe Europeans and the Atlanticist world would see that, right? So I think that, for me then, depending on if you keep Vancouver in the national imaginary, it will always occupy a particular place. So being far away, being marginal. But if we look towards the Pacific, you shift how you think about your location, right? And then specific to Vancouver as well, Indigenous sovereignty activism, very intense at the moment. Talk of reconciliation, at least I feel, is debated in the mainstream, even in the university. So those things are actually very intense, and from my conversation it seems more intense than here. Environmental activism, very intense in the sense of we're caught right in the middle of all the pipeline debate. The Trans Mountain Pipeline actually runs through SFU in Burnaby. So this is very, very real, right, for people in the city. And then, of course, the demographic is shifting in such a way. I'll give you a little stats. This was from my recent article, I did a little research, is by 2031, so-called visible minorities of people of color will no longer be minority. And it's ironic to say visible minorities because 60% is not a minority, right? And yet it's also a particular demographic, if you can see. It's a kind of Asian demographic where the Asian is in contestation, right? Used to be the Asian would stand in for East Asian, but in this demographic, actually, even what we mean by Asian has to be negotiated. And I see that as that demographic change also being specific to Vancouver really affects the way we do any kind of community activism. And so if I look at what's happened even in the past decade, is that for queers of color who have very limited resources, and they have to need for space sharing, so let's say you want to have a community-centered bill where you can kind of feel safe from racism in the mainstream queer community, you have to learn to have that space across, say, many different minority groups, right? And so the production of queer communities already have to do a kind of inter-referencing. A lot of the languages borrow from multiculturalism policy, but I will show you an example of how I think it also resists the kind of multicultural production of single ethnic subjectivity. So for instance, these are some of the activism when I was younger that I was involved in. So Asia, the Asian Society for the Intervention of AIDS, which was active from late 90s to 2011, they had to produce a whole new set of culturally sensitive sexual health literature, and they wanted to produce it in different languages, right? So even however you think of the end product, the very process of people sitting together having to say, well, how do you say love and sex in Vietnamese, and how is that valence different from saying it in Chinese? And that process of even producing these pamphlets, right, does something to your identity as, say, a queer of color person in Vancouver. And that kind of activism happens across the board. So in health activism, but also I was involved in Lotus Roots, which was a kind of Queer Asia cultural festival. And we did 3 or 4 iterations in the late 90s and the aughts, right? And you can even see just the name itself, Lotus Roots. There was a lot of negotiation on how to come up with that, because it has meaning across different Asian cultures. Lotus flower is sacred in South Asian culture. Lotus roots is a food that East Asians eat. And so that was that negotiation of wanting to have a symbol that could work across. And it's also a tongue-in-cheek kind of play on the orientalizing fantasy of always equating minorities with food, right? So we thought, Lotus roots is good. It's kind of, it's in your face, but it also works across different Asian cultures. And then Salaam Canada has a chapter in Toronto as well, has to organize around Muslim, queer and Muslim. And again, you know, in Vancouver, the Muslim demographic have to cut across Farsi-speaking, Arabic-speaking, and a lot of different South Asian languages. And they have to navigate also between different iterations of Muslim communities. So again, you know, much like the other kinds of activism, the demographic itself, in terms of resource sharing, already demand a kind of, I think, interreferencing that for me is really inspiring and important. I'll close with the youngest activist that I'm still learning from. Yesterday I showed some posters from this group that were, you know, they were doing poster campaign all around town. And this is actually a second iteration of the poster campaign, where instead of just having posters of, you know, queers of color, what they did was they did these fake movie posters. And not always fake, you know, like it's a mixture of real and fake movie poster. So the indigenous film is actually a real short film that they produced, so you have a movie poster. But the superhero film there was no actual superhero racism fighting film, but they did a whole bunch of this poster, which I think is really interesting because it's a way of establishing visibility, but doing it in a way with full realization that visibility is always constructed. It's fictional. Oftentimes it's, you know, like referencing different pop culture. So I thought this campaign actually, you know, become quite sophisticated and do visibility work in a way that is quite challenging. Now I will end on the group that I really feel quite inspired by. Jen Sunshine and David David actually was one of my former students, and they were two of the kind of most active people in Vancouver doing work. And they started this blog called Love Intersections. And if you even take the time to read what they talked about, what you will see is kind of this intense negotiation between how to do resistant politics that fight against all oppression without losing what we can do to invite people in. So their slogan, calling you in instead of calling you out, is very much dealing with the calling out politics, which I know a lot of young activists were really deeply impacted by, right? And so this play with, maybe we can try calling people in, is to try to figure out a politics, a discourse that can be radical, but without being alienating, that has some potential of inviting people in. And I love how they self-identify as millennial, and they try to write in a way that I feel very millennial, you know. We ask, how do we love? We know, you know, we know that these vulnerable narratives can be sappy, and you can find them corny, and so they hashtag sappy, hashtag gentle, hashtag feelings, right? And I feel like that's a very millennial way of working through, you know, of how do I do the politics that people might find sappy, but I feel like it's needed. I want to be fierce and woke, but I also want to be gentle, and I want to invite people in. So I get excited when I, you know, this for me is very different from how I organized when I was young. The language is different, the nature of the activism is different, but I feel like it's only from looking here and really learning it can help me do my scholarship and teach my class better. So the community activism is something that I feel should always be nurtured with love as well from other people. So thank you. I leave you with love from Vancouver.
It's really incredible to be here with all of you, and particularly to be here with Helen and Xavier, who I haven't seen in a while. I haven't seen Helen in quite a while. Probably. Yeah, but what's incredible listening to you is how in tune we are in terms of our thinking, and I felt that with you too, Xavier. Like we're all sort of thinking together, even though we're not physically in the same space. And so I'm very grateful to Dana, Robert, everybody else who brought us together. It's really remarkable. So, so Helen mentioned so many things that really resonate with what I'm going to talk about. But she mentioned doing sort of translocal queer work, and in a lot of ways I think that's what I'm going to share with you, is a kind of translocal queer reading of a particular artist. So just keep that in mind in terms of thinking about the resonances between our work. So I'm going to give you a broad sense of the stakes of a new book that I have coming out in Unruly Visions. And then I'll go into a reading of the work of one of the contemporary artists I talk about in the book, the Lebanese artist Akram Zaatari. So just so you have a sense of it, the book spans a wide range of contemporary queer visual culture, from film to photography to fine art. And in a lot of ways it stages what I would call unexpected encounters between different visual texts. And I say that they're unexpected encounters because a lot of the artists I write about come from very disparate diasporic trajectories. So I put the work of Akram Zaatari, who's Lebanese, in relation to South Asian diasporic artists like Shiba Chachi or Alan D'Souza or Chitra Ganesh. I also talk about artists of color within the US, indigenous artists in Australia, so I'm literally kind of all over the map. But what I think is, what I'm trying to do is use the concept of the aesthetic practices of queer diaspora as a kind of capacious framework that allows me to hold these different visual texts together. And I think this is where Helen and I are quite attuned, because I think it's really important to have these kind of conceptual tools that allow us to not simply stick in the area that we feel like we are constrained to sticking in, right? So my first book was really all about the South Asian diaspora, and I felt very strongly in the second book that I wanted to think about not really comparative diasporas as much as intersecting diasporas, overlapping diasporas, right? The ways in which different sort of migratory and diasporic trajectories sort of come together and come apart. Okay. So today, though, we don't have that much time. So I'm just going to talk about the work of this one artist, Akram Zaatari, who figures quite prominently in my book. He's probably one of the best-known artists in Lebanon, and he's also one of the few, really, who explicitly engages with questions of homoeroticism in his work. And so through my reading of his work, I hope you get a sense of sort of the larger stakes of the book. So the talk is drawn from an article on Zaatari that recently appeared in the journal JMU's, Journal of Middle East Women's Studies that Dana mentioned. And I also want to give a shout out to Dina Georges, who's a professor here who also writes about Zaatari. And I want to thank Matthew. I was like, Michael? No. Matthew, who I just met yesterday, who alerted me to some of Dina's new work on Zaatari. Okay. Let's see if I can work this. Enter. Okay. Okay. So part one, archive, region, affect, aesthetics, an introduction to Unruly Visions. The image stopped me in my tracks. I know you, I thought, as I gazed at the black and white photograph from the early 1950s. Identified in the caption simply as Abed, a tailor, the subject in the photograph looks forthrightly into the camera as he leans on his elbows with his hands folded gracefully under his chin. There was something in Abed's gaze, direct, uncompromising, fierce, and the precise and delicate gesture of his hands framing his face that evoked the femme aesthetic of the young queers of color I remember seeing on the Hudson River piers during my young adulthood in New York City in the early 1990s. With his finely chiseled face, perfectly arched eyebrows, and elaborate hair, Abed was to my contemporary gaze immediately recognizable as a genderqueer or gender nonconforming figure. I first encountered this image while leafing through the 2004 co-edited book Hashem El-Madani Studio Practices by the Beirut-based Lebanese artist Akram Zaatari. El-Madani was a studio photographer from Saida, Zaatari's coastal hometown in southern Lebanon, and the book was created to coincide with the first exhibition of El-Madani's work in the UK, which Zaatari co-curated in London in 2004. El-Madani opened his studio Sherazad in Saida in 1953, and over more than 50 years created hundreds of thousands of portraits of Saida's residents. And I think it's something like actually 500,000 negatives that Zaatari found in El-Madani's studio. These are photos of brides and grooms, wrestlers and babies, resistance fighters, and refugees. The portraits in Hashem El-Madani's studio practices date from the early 1950s to the mid-1970s and tell of the self-representational practices in the mid-20th century city. Zaatari's fascination with El-Madani's work stems from his general interest in the making of modernity in Lebanon, and specifically in the role of image-making practices such as studio photography. But of special interest to Zaatari is El-Madani as a chronicler of everyday life in South Lebanon per se, a region rendered other in relation to the larger Lebanese nation by successive waves of war and Israeli occupation between 1978 and 2000. In Hashem El-Madani's studio practices, Zaatari, in his dual role as artist and curator, reproduces and organizes specific images from El-Madani's vast collection that he finds especially significant and moving. It was striking to me that of the thousands of negatives in El-Madani's collection, a significant number of the images reprinted by Zaatari suggest some version of gender nonconformity or same-sex eroticism. This includes the photograph of Abed, a tailor, that I found so striking. But despite my visceral initial sense of familiarity upon encountering this image, the longer I gazed at it, the further it receded. Given that a photograph can never act as a transparent or unmediated visual record of the past, the image cannot tell me who Abed really was, who or how he desired, or what his gendered embodiment definitively meant to him or those around him. Rather, as my own initial shock of recognition or misrecognition suggests, Zaatari's representation of El-Madani's images activates trans-temporal relays of affective relationality between the subjects in the photograph, Zaatari, and other contemporary viewers, such as myself and all of us in this room, that produce new meanings for these images as they circulate in the present. I'll discuss Zaatari's work further in a moment, but I open with this image and my initial response to it as it exemplifies the interrelation of archive, region, affect, and aesthetics that is my central concern in Unruly Visions. My turn to the region, and this is completely in line with the project of Inter-Asia, my turn to the region counters standard formulations of diaspora that inevitably foreground the nation-state, as well as formulations of queerness that fail to grasp the texture of regionally inflected gender and sexual formations. And I should say that when I use the term region in my work, I'm referring both to subnational locations, which I'll talk about here today, but I'm also referring to supranational entities. And that's what I find quite useful about the category of region in relation to queer studies, that it can shift spatial scales in this quite plastic way. My goal is to identify a queer visual aesthetic that mobilizes new ways of seeing both regions and archives, and that puts into play an intimate relation between the two through an affective register. What I call the aesthetic practices of queer diaspora conjure forth a queer regional imaginary that stands in contradistinction to a dominant nationalist imaginary that effaces non-conforming bodies, desires, and affiliations. At first glance, the work of Zaatari seems to serve as the limit test to queer diaspora. Zaatari has been based primarily in Beirut throughout his career. While there's been a fair amount of critical attention given to the explicit homoeroticism in some of his work, it's never spoken about in relation to diaspora. And in fact, yesterday I was mentioning in the experimental classroom that, I shared some of this work with the artist, and in general, he really appreciated the reading of the work, but he really took exception with being labeled as a diasporic artist, right? And because he felt like, hey, I've stayed in Lebanon, I've stayed in Beirut, many artists have left, but he has stayed, and that for him was a really intense point of pride. And so, one of the folks in the room yesterday asked me, well, why are you talking about him as diasporic? And in some ways, this is an extended response to that question, how I'm using the category of diaspora to talk about an artist like Zaatari, who is primarily based in one location. But Zaatari's sort of pushback against my reading also brings up the question for those of us who write about living artists, right? What happens when your reading as a critic is actually at odds with the people you write about, and what are the ethics of that? And so I've sort of had to struggle with that. Okay. So I want to suggest that seeing his work as emerging out of a queer diasporic formation pushes us to reconsider the meanings of both diaspora and queerness in necessary ways. And this is a point I'll come back to at the end of the talk. All right. So let's now enter into Zaatari's 2004 project, Hashim al-Madani Studio Practices. Zaatari's curation of al-Madani's photographic archive enacts what I would call a queer optic, one that brings to the fore those shadow histories, practices, and desires that are occluded in dominant tellings of history. To be clear, I do not mean to suggest that Zaatari is simply excavating images of queers from the historical record. Rather, I contend that Zaatari transforms al-Madani's collection into a queer archive through his own affective and erotic attachment to the photographs. In other words, the queerness of the archive rests in the fact that it acts as a record and performance of queer affects between the subjects in the photograph and Zaatari himself. And so that's what I'm trying to grapple with here, is where does the queerness of these images reside, right? Zaatari's affective and erotic attachment to the photographs is apparent both in his choice of which photographs to reproduce and how he chooses to order and arrange them. This is particularly clear in the many images of Palestinian resistance fighters from the 1960s and 70s that Zaatari reproduces from al-Madani's collection. Zaatari has commented in interviews that during his childhood, these resistance fighters were the erotic objects of his youthful gaze. In Hashim al-Madani Studio Practices, these images of Palestinian militants are preceded by an image of a bare-chested young man and a series of images of a flexing bodybuilder. And there's many of these, I'm just giving you one of them. Zaatari thereby makes evident his erotic attachment to all of these figures. Indeed, okay, it keeps going here. Here we go, okay. Indeed, he deploys what I call a trans-temporal queer gaze that brings into the present the homoerotically charged figure of the resistance fighter from the past. But Zaatari's evocation of the resistance fighter is not a naive romanticization of earlier liberation movements. Rather, Zaatari enacts a disidentificatory relation to the figure of the revolutionary male militant and the nationalist projects that he represents. He's interested in bringing to the surface the fissures and fault lines, the negative spaces, so to speak, of state and revolutionary nationalist movements and the gendered and sexual formations to which they give rise, even as he insists on the affective and libidinal pull that these formations continue to exert on the present. Zaatari lays bare these negative spaces of dominant histories in a particularly disturbing pair of photographs in Hashim al-Madani Studio Practices. He would later name these images scratch portraits of Mrs. Bakari when he reprinted and enlarged them as part of his 2012 Damaged Negative series. And when I first encountered these images, I found them really sort of shocking in some ways, sort of startling, because they come after all of these images of this kind of, this buffed out, hyper-militant masculinity, and suddenly we're left with these, right? So I was trying to make sense of that juxtaposition that Zaatari enacts for us. In the poignant caption that accompanies these images in Hashim al-Madani Studio Practices, al-Madani explains that he used a pin to scratch the negatives of the portraits of a young woman that he had taken in 1957. He did so in response to what he calls her jealous husband, who was angered that she had come to Studio Sherazad without his knowledge. the husband demanded that El-Madani return the negatives to him. El-Madani refused, and instead agreed to damage the negatives so they could no longer be printed or circulated. El-Madani writes, quote, "Years later, after she burned herself to death to escape her misery, he came back to me asking for enlargements of those photographs or other photographs she might have taken without his permission," end quote. Zaatari creates two prints from El-Madani's damaged negatives. In the first, a young woman gazes soulfully at the camera as she stands against a pillar in a white blouse and black skirt. In the second, she poses with a water jug on her shoulder in sort of Bedouin garb, playing out a picturesque scene of rural life. Both of these images are defaced by black scratches that slash across the woman's face, leaving the rest of her body and background relatively unscathed. These images, I think, have a particular force when viewed alongside the various images of hyperbolic masculinity in Zaatari's reconstituted archive of El-Madani's photographs. The obliteration of the woman's face speaks to the material and representational effacements enacted by standard patriarchal tellings of history. Such gendered forms of violence are cast as merely private and not worthy of inclusion within larger nationalist or collective historical narratives. Thus, we can read these scratched portraits of Mrs. Bakari as precisely the damaged negatives that shadow Zaatari's ambivalent, desiring relation to the figure of the male resistance fighter and the heroic telling of nationalist history that he represents. These scratch portraits reveal the surfaces and the textures of the obverse, the surplus and the discarded, the minor and the marginal that stand as the shadow and in the shadow of history with a capital H. So my point is that, it's really crucial that Zaatari chooses to end that whole series of images of hyperbolic militant masculinity with these images. He doesn't simply rest with sort of the queering of the nationalist fighter with the homoerotic images, right? So I would say that, by that juxtaposition makes clear that valorizing a masculinist version of history, even if you queer it, right, has the effect of obscuring female subjectivity and legitimizing the violences on female bodies. So, I'm really interested in not just a kind of queer homoerotic reading of these images, but a feminist one, right? And so how do we do both, right? And again, this is where my work as a critic is really entering into it, obviously, because I don't know what Zaatari wanted to do in that framing, right? In the way he ordered the images. But to me, that ordering of the images enacts a kind of both feminist and queer critique of dominant history, right? El-Madani's collection is a testament to the pre-Civil War, pre-occupation past of the particular region of South Lebanon. So to clarify, as you may know, the Civil War in Lebanon took place from 1975 to 1990, but the Israeli occupation of South Lebanon continued to 2000. So in some ways, South Lebanon had this kind of exemplary status in relation to the larger Lebanese nation, right? It is significant that Zaatari chooses this regional archive of South Lebanon as his point of entry into an excavation of the reverse images of history. In choosing to highlight from El-Madani's collection images that hint at same-sex desire and relationality, as well as gender nonconformity, Zaatari frames South Lebanon within what I'm calling a queer regional imaginary. The contours of this queer regional imaginary become apparent if we return here to the image with which I opened this talk. Abed Tailor is in fact one in a series that was taken by El-Madani sometime between 1948 and 53. They are accompanied by a succinct yet telling caption from El-Madani. He writes, "As he was effeminate, I would give him poses that I usually chose for women. He used to come often to the studio with his family and friends," end quote. The series consists of 5 portraits. In one pair of images, Abed reclines on a pedestal, one arm propping up his head, while the other hand rests on his waist, his body arranged in perfect geometric lines. A twinned image that Zaatari displays directly below this one depicts a young woman identified as Abed's sister in the very same pose, sporting a similar hairstyle. The final pair of images show Abed with two different male figures. In one, Abed casually drapes his arms over the shoulders of what I would call his more butch companion, and in the other, Abed gracefully leans into the torso of a dapper man who is outfitted in a suit with a flower in his lapel and whose arm wraps protectively, or perhaps proprietarily, around Abed's shoulder. What I find most remarkable about these images and about El-Madani's accompanying commentary is just how unremarkable they both are. El-Madani's non-judgmental, matter-of-fact explication, as well as the images of Abed gazing calmly and confidently into the camera with his sister and male companions, give a sense of an individual whose gender nonconformity is not spectacular or fetishized, but in fact quite embedded into the everyday of the studio space. While it would be reductive to take the photographs as a mere reflection of a reality outside the photo studio, we can read the images as aspirational enactments and performances of queer dwelling. And that's a sort of concept that I keep coming back to throughout the book, you know, the ways in which queers find ways to dwell in these apparently inhospitable spaces. These images produce Abed as a subject who's deeply embedded within a rich social world, within a network of friends, lovers, family members, and they speak to the quotidian strategies of self-representation by which queer subjects envision a sense of place and emplacement. So what is the effect of a contemporary artist such as Zaatari excavating and placing into public circulation these images of gender nonconformity taken some 50 years earlier? I would argue that Zaatari's resuscitation of El-Madani's images insist on the centrality of the memory of alternative modes of desire and embodiment, kinship and affiliation, to the project of imagining a different present. Zaatari's reanimation of El-Madani's portraits, in effect, brings into the present field of vision the memory of everyday forms of queerness that may have marked the space of the region as subnational location. This queer regional imaginary is also evoked in the images of same-sex intimacy that Zaatari highlights from El-Madani's collection. We have images of two women kissing each other somewhat awkwardly. And you always see that they're very aware of performing for the camera, right? There's nothing, sort of natural about these images. They're very posed. A man planting a tender kiss on another man's face, cross-dressing brides and grooms, and there's a whole series of these that Zaatari includes. In an interview with Zaatari, El-Madani comments that, quote, in a conservative society such as Saida, as he puts it, social mores kept people from enacting heterosexual desires on camera. Thus, he says, same-sex role-playing became the practice norm as a way to circumvent the societal strictures against public displays of sexuality between men and women. In light of El-Madani's statement, one could simply take these images at face value as documents of an adherence to strict gender codes strict codes of gender and sexual normativity, where what appeared to be articulations of same-sex desire are simply a substitute for the real thing, that is, heterosexuality. However, I want to suggest a different reading of these images. Reading these images through a queer optic suggests that the sexual and gender conservatism of Saida may in fact have enabled especially playful and pleasurable forms of same-sex eroticism and gender crossing to thrive in the interstices of heteronormativity. Indeed, Zaatari frames South Lebanon as a queer region, a space that exists in a deliberately obscured and forgotten elsewhere within the national imagination. This othered space evinces its own gender and sexual logics that may disturb or trouble the apparently smooth surfaces of heteronormative nationalist ideologies. Thus, the reverse images that Zaatari gleans from El-Madani's archive conjure forth a queer regional imaginary within which we can discern the contours of female subjectivity, gender nonconformity, and queer desire that stand outside the confines of dominant history. In so doing, Zaatari summons into the present a queer world that is most certainly lost to us now, but that nevertheless suggests an alternative to the violent present and its toxic sectarian and nationalist ideologies. Thus, Zaatari's curation of El Madani's images evokes past possibilities and logics of political and social life in order to suggest other trajectories for the present. Crucially, it is through queer desire, identification, and relationality that these visions of the past are renewed and reactivated. So by way of conclusion, and to circle back to the point with which I began this talk, understanding Zaatari under the rubric of the aesthetic practices of queer diaspora demands that we reframe the parameters of both diaspora and queerness. In relation to diaspora, Zaatari's work demands that we rethink the concept to account for the movements and dispersals that happen within, rather than simply across, dominant nation-state boundaries. In other words, his work evinces a capacious understanding of diaspora that signals the constant shifting of borders precipitated by the vagaries of war and occupation. In other words, war and occupation engender a particular and peculiar kind of diasporic consciousness that emerges ostensibly within the boundaries of the nation-state, precisely because of displacement and relocation. So through his work, and again, this came up at the experimental classroom yesterday, and in relation to Xavier's work as well, who was talking about internal migrations. So I would say that, Zaatari allows us to see how the nation functions as precisely diaspora space, to cite Avdar-Bras' still useful term, right? As a space that's shot through with diasporic trajectories. And so it really forces us to constantly be thinking about the imbrication of nation and diaspora. I also hope to have suggested the need to stretch the category of queer in important ways. Queerness functions as an optic through which to engage past histories and be attuned to the way these histories continue to imprint the present. For Zaatari, a queer optic reanimates non-normative desires, embodiments, and affiliations that can be gleaned from the past. His work brings them into the present in order to envision other possibilities of social life. Thus, the queerness of the work derives from multiple sources. First, the work itself produces a certain way of seeing that I'm calling queer. This alternative vision brings to the fore that which is obscured by dominant historical narratives. Second, the queerness of the work derives from a specific affective dynamic between the artist and the historical archive. So it is Zaatari's own libidinal investment, as one critic puts it, in El Madani's images that brings their queer valences to the fore. And finally, the queerness of the work is predicated on the particular investments of each of us as viewers. We each come to the work with our own situated spectatorial gaze. And so in my own case, I'm doing what I would call a kind of queer curatorial work, right? When I place Zaatari alongside, say, South Asian artists in the book, or artists emerging from other diasporic trajectories. So in some ways, the queerness of the work also emerges in the placement, right, of the texts in our own sort of critical envisioning of them. Reveal how all spaces of home and dwelling are shot through with contradictions and fissures, that there is no going back, no return to an unsullied past, no secure space of safety. In light of this knowledge, these aesthetic practices suggest that those who are subject to the various regimes of power nevertheless find viable and indeed pleasurable ways to dwell, in the wake of violence and uncertainty, displacement and dispossession. They thereby offer a nuanced sense of the relation between staying and leaving, mobility and immobility, home and exile, dwelling and displacement, that always attends to the co-constitutive nature of these terms. In this sense, the aesthetic practices of queer diaspora are in fact modes of dwelling and emplacement. They rearrange and emplace us as viewers in a different relation to space and time, history and memory. They bring into the realm of the present those traces of the past that provide the occasion for a different sense of possibility and horizon. Thank you.
I'd like to just reiterate what my fellow panelists said, which is to thank everyone who was involved in putting together this conversation for their hard work in doing so. I also would like to thank my fellow panelists. They have produced work which is quite generative and allows us to, I think, have some of these transnational and diasporic conversations in very interesting and different ways. Lastly, I'd like to thank you guys for coming out. I mean, I know I don't come out on Friday afternoons, so thank you for being here and giving us the generosity of your time. I just want to say that my talk in many ways builds off of some of the points made by Gayatri. I mean, we didn't quite plan this, but because I am interested in these questions of visibility, and for any of you who are familiar with my work, you know that that is a central component of some of my work, but also these questions of what it means to make spaces that are otherwise somewhat inhospitable into hospitable, livable spaces. So along that line, I'll be speaking about Soweto Pride as pleasure principle, but one of the things I'm really interested in is what are the pleasures and practices and possibilities of queer looking. So I would like to begin my talk by thinking about practices of looking, practices of seeing, and practices of leisure, or leisure, is it? I don't know. That inform the embodied experience of Black queerness and continue to my understanding of the need to center pleasure as an important analytic in the critical work of African queer studies. To do so, I begin with two ethnographic vignettes taken from my participant observation at the 2015 Soweto Pride event. And the pictures that you're going to be seeing are from that event. Not taken by me. I do try to credit the photographer when I know who it is. So these are the vignettes. As we drove to Meadowlands, the sense of excitement and participation of the occupants grew. While we had all attended Soweto Pride before, it seemed that this year's event was bigger, bolder, more present in the public imaginary. As we neared the Meadowlands police station and its adjacent park, the foot traffic surrounding the car grew. Young Black queers, especially Black queer women, occupied the space. Friends called out to each other. Hugs were exchanged. Looks had been carefully crafted. These young Black queers from high femme to butch were dressed for the occasion. I had not anticipated having to look for parking, but one of the benefits of having to carefully negotiate foot traffic was that you had to slow down, and the process of driving became also a social practice of being seen and seeing. After parking the car, the walk to the park became an unofficial catwalk where recognition was being served. Specifically, the recognition of Black queerness, the celebration of Blackness in its diversity, in its sexual spectrum, in its gender non-conformity. As we approached the park, this modulation, sorry guys. As we approached the park, the music became louder, beckoning you to enter the space. And as we entered, we were confronted with a beautiful sight. Young Black queers, particularly Black queer women, had created space. Space for leisure and space for pleasure. I could not help but notice the palpable space of desire as I walked through the park. Black queer women, young Black queer women, claimed this space. They dressed and performed for one another's gaze, the sly look, the tight hold, the subtle lingering of hand over flesh. All of this combined to create the sensual texture of the events for the day. So the second vignette. Performances both on and off the stage were a critical part of the experience. A group of limber-lied Black queer men, resilient in their feminist, stood posed in formation. What would they perform and how would they move? What would they signify? As I looked up on the stage, my body was overcome with the beat of the house music soundtrack. Each thump compelled the body to move as the sonic vibrations literally pulsed through the body. And these queens danced. Black femme boys twirled their bodies, twisted their heads, splayed their limbs. In a combined display of agility, they danced, their bodies at once inhibiting extreme vulnerability and strength. They danced with joy and abandon. The crowd cheered in exuberance, celebrating their movement. Each of these vignettes, while pulling from different embodied experiences and practices, are all deeply concerned with what Zaatari Emma has identified as a space for embodied knowledge. The practices of looking and seeing, the moment of being overcome with passion, all point to the possibilities of pleasure within the African queer body. As Cassandra Lord has stated in a recent talk, we want to be able to get to those goosebump moments, those moments where possibility and infinity, that notion that you can do and be almost anything in that moment, combine. In my brief remarks today, I would like to frame my analytic through the ways in which the practices of looking and seeing, so often an experience of violence and disempowerment for Black queers, can be reframed in these moments, and in particular, the work, to borrow from Robin Kelly, the cultural labor that gets enacted to create these alternative practices. Theoretically, I draw from two traditions of scholarship focusing on the politics of pleasure on the one hand and the politics of looking and seeing on the other, both of which have been central concerns for Black feminism and Black queer studies more generally, and African feminism and African queer studies more specifically. African feminists such as Patricia McFadden, who argue for pleasure at the heart of female freedom and power, are an important framing device for thinking about this work. In thinking about practices of looking, I am also imagining the space of Black queer lives that allows for the politics of seeing something new. The kinds of visibilities that Ain El Helweh explores in her visual archive, which become not only about revealing the hidden, but about forcing us to see differently. In forcing us to see differently, we can momentarily reframe practices and politics of looking and think about the simultaneous politics of pleasure and the pleasure of politics. Ultimately, I want to think about the politics of pleasure through this Soweto Pride event, specifically what it meant to do the labor to create the social space of joy, and what conventional politics of Pride events may have to be rethought in order to create the spaces of freedom for Black queers. I invite us to consider why at this present moment such a politics might be necessary. Part of why these politics are necessary for our consideration is the current state of what publicly available spaces, not linked directly to consumption, allow for Black queer being. If such spaces are in the main not always available or accessible, then what would it mean that one important political intervention for any group concerned about Black queer life might be to create those spaces? As I've argued elsewhere, the fight for leisure is always bound to politics, precisely because the possibilities for social space are fundamentally connected to notions of social power. I attended the first Soweto Pride back in the early 2000s. It was an event created specifically to address the needs of Black queer and gender nonconforming women living in South Africa's townships, as well as to create an alternative pride that was based in Soweto. From the beginning of the event, it was imagined as a social and communal space of accessibility, in contrast to Johannesburg Pride events, which trafficked in the politics of exclusion. As the years have passed, the event has grown both in its number of participants as well as its profile in the community. During my most recent attendance, the organizers wanted to continue to bring attention to the multiple forms of violence experienced by Black queer women and the unresolved murders of Zizakele Sigasa and Salome Masua, which actually are still under investigation, so still to this day unsolved. Symbolically, the march allied itself, with an increasingly global movement of Black Lives Matters, at the very least drawing from the notion of lives mattering and creating a flyer that stated "Our Lives Matter." This is an important declarative and performative act because fundamentally the struggle remains to make Black queer lives, particularly those of Black queer women, matter, not only for the prosecution of violence against their bodies, but also in the experiences of freedom and possibility outside the framing of Black queer lives as disposable. So in the year 2016, after these pictures were taken, the Soweto Pride event had to be postponed and actually ended up being canceled. It was brought back into 2017, and I'll have something to say about that. The organizers, the Forum for an Empowerment of Women, stated that the event had to be canceled due to state coercion. So they stated that there were two forms that this state coercion took. First was the upgrading of the event to a higher risk category, from low risk to medium risk, which then required the organizers to hire more police and security detail. Despite the fact that the South African Police Service could not cite specifically the forms of disruption and unruliness that required this upgrade. This upgrade meant 22 additional police officers, 300 additional marshals, and 80 additional security guards. That was at a cost of about 150,000 Rand, which for a small local-based NGO is prohibitively expensive. The South African Police Service also suggested that the group orient the Pride away from its inclusive measures, which included holding the Pride in accessible space during the day while transportation is still running, and not charging an admission fee, and allowing people to bring their own provisions, food and drink, into the space. Authorities had demanded that it charge an entrance fee as a means of crowd control and obtain a liquor license and sell alcohol at the venue, both of which the group who organized the Pride said was against the ethos of their organizations. So for their own part, the organizers of the Pride point to what they perceive to be increasing state distrust and attempts to manage protests and dissent as being at the heart of these measures. By imposing impossible-to-meet conditions, the state basically ensures that the event and the politics that it creates does not happen. Furthermore, for the organizers, this was not just a matter of finances. This was also about to what extent do the politics of Black queer life submit themselves to state management and control. I would also like to add the symbolic nature of Black queer bodies occupying space, particularly in large numbers. That is, perhaps it is the Black queer body itself, especially those who are gender non-conforming and non-normative in other ways, that are the truly unruly subjects that the police are trying to control. Their sheer existence and desire to claim space and critique the state makes the event and its participants both unruly and disruptive. At the same time, the more white elite-dominated Johannesburg Pride seems intent on moving its festivities to ever more exclusive enclaves. So like with each year, it just gets to be more and more upscale neighborhood that they move it to, right? And for anyone who knows Johannesburg, this Pride Parade began in the center city, then it's moved to Rosebank, now it's in Melrose Arch. These are just like increasingly exclusive venues. While admission to these spaces are free, food and drinks will have to be purchased in that space, and being a nighttime event, transportation, particularly for those that are living in the periphery of the city, will always be an issue. The queer body in this particular case with Johannesburg Pride has been reduced to its availability to the market as a consumer. And Twitter commentary from a variety of attendees remarked both that the event felt like attending a European Pride event, given literally the whiteness of the space and also its cost. So let me be clear, I do think that there is a potential political project in making these kinds of spaces more accessible for all. So, you know, I'm all for the idea that something like Johannesburg Pride needs to change the way it does its work, but that's not really my political project that I'm invested in or interested in, but I agree that there is a project there. But I would also argue that part of the failure of Joburg Pride is that we have to ask these questions about accessibility in the first place. So Black queers excluded both literally and figuratively from Johannesburg Pride. They also that year didn't even have their own Pride in their own space available to them. So ironically, the decisions made by Joburg Pride to hold the event at Melrose Arch were a result of some of the same constraints placed on Soweto Pride organizers. Joburg Pride organizers specifically cited the untenable cost of hosting open-air accessible prides as a reason for their relocation to Melrose Arch, rather than perhaps finding a more accessible space in the city. While Soweto Pride organizers then resisted this commodification and coercive practice of the state, it seemed to be that Johannesburg Pride organizers appeared to have capitulated to it in the name of both safety and leisure. But important questions have to be asked about safety for which queer bodies, who has the right to pleasure and leisure. When queers can be managed as consuming upscale subjects, that seems to be most acceptable to the state. In the brief time that I have left, I would like to return to the efforts that the organizers of Soweto Pride take for the creation of a specifically social space, one that allowed for particular kinds of practices of embodied freedom. One of the controversial moves of the organizers from 2015 was to ban HIV testing at the event. For the organizers, they spoke about how this was a feminist principle to move away from influencing people to test in social space. The organizers specifically said that their space was a social space that was political because it was social, and that the compulsion to test went against their goals. This was not about preventing Black gay men from being able to test and know their status. So one of the controversies was that a lot of these like big time HIV organizations in South Africa, they're pretty much run by white, very, very privileged white gay men. Many of whom are actually not even South African, they're from the West. You know, sort of telling Black lesbian women who are running a Soweto Pride that they're like preventing access to healthcare for Black gay men. I mean, it was ridiculous, but this was the way that it was framed. So I just wanted to make it clear that for the organizers, this was not about, you know, preventing Black gay men from being able to test or knowing their status. Rather, this was about saying that the space being created by Soweto Pride was perhaps not the right space for this kind of state and NGO-funded mechanism of biopower to intervene. I feel that unstated in this observation is also the idea that testing subjects, it subjects the bodies to particular kinds of surveillance. And so what might it mean for just this one day, for this one event, for the Black queer body to not be sutured to narratives of disease? This is not to say that Soweto Pride is completely free from forms of commodification. In the intervening years, a number of after parties, including an official after party, have emerged to cater for, you know, these sort of after Pride events. And here's, you know, a flyer of one of those events. I mean, this kind of thing when Soweto Pride began would have been impossible. So it's really interesting to think about specifically Black entrepreneurs in Soweto trying to capture the pink rand, right? Which is an interesting other conversation. So I want to point out that it's clear that forms of exclusion occur in these spaces, and while time doesn't allow for me to engage fully the work done in these venues to make Black queer space, I would like to think about these spaces of consumption as doing particular kinds of work that does not reduce Black queer consumption simply to an unfortunate byproduct of neoliberal capitalism, even as it may be embedded in those structures. What my observation suggests is that in constructing leisure space, in constructing social space, there may be well-known conventions of consumptions and notions of health practice that need to be challenged or reconfigured. To challenge these conventions is ultimately a political act. To fight for these politics is ultimately pleasurable. To occupy these spaces as communal Black queer bodies ultimately reimagines these practices of observation. So ultimately, I return back to the space of embodied Black queerness signified by Soweto Pride. The space of Soweto Pride, the space that Soweto Pride creates serves as a challenge to forms of state and societal exclusion. How might we think about these practices of self-care and self-formation that occur before Black queers even arrive in the space, right? So all of that, those practices of getting yourself ready before you go. How might we think about the community of care that arises once the space and the forms of intense pleasure that are created in gathering in community and looking and seeing Black queer bodies en masse, taking up space, queering it, refusing the norm of social death, and celebrating life?